Sometimes a man loses everything before he discovers what he's truly made of. When grief strips away, your pride and poverty takes your hope. All that's left is the choice to keep standing or fall forever. In a small Arizona town, wealthy rancher Silas McGraw makes a foolish bet. He wagers his entire ranch that no man can tame his wild stallion Diablo. Poor widower Eli Boone steps forward to accept the challenge. Everyone thinks Eli is crazy. The stallion has never been broken. McGraw has never lost a bet. But Eli sees something in the horse's wild eyes that others miss. He recognizes the pain of a creature that has forgotten how to trust. As word spreads through the dusty streets, the whole town gathers to watch. Will a broken man find the strength to gentle a broken horse? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Eli Boone stood at his wife's grave, turning the worn gold band on his finger. The Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on the small cemetery outside Copper Ridge, where weathered headstones told stories of hardship and hope in equal measure. Sarah's marker was simple granite, carved with words that still made his chest tight. Beloved wife and light of my life. 3 years had passed since fever took her, yet the ring remained on his finger not from habit, but from the fear that removing it would mean letting go of the only good thing he'd ever known. The wind carried dust and the distant sound of cattle from the McGraw ranch, where Silas McGraw ruled his empire with iron fists and silver spurs. Those spurs were famous throughout the territory, crafted by the finest silversmith in Tucson and polished to a mirror shine. They jangled when McGraw walked, announcing his presence like a warning bell. He wore them everywhere, to church, to the bank, even to his own dining table, as if the world needed constant reminding of his station. Eli's own spurs were plain iron, practical and unadorned. Like everything else he owned, they served a purpose without putting on airs. His small ranch bordered McGraw's vast holdings, a fact that McGraw never let him forget. Where McGraw's fences were straight and strong, painted white as fresh snow, Eli's sagged with age and necessity. Where McGraw's barns gleamed with fresh paint, Eli's weathered wood told stories of too many storms weathered alone. You fixing to stand there all morning, or you got cattle to tend? The voice belonged to Martha Hendricks, the widow who ran the general store with the efficiency of a railroad conductor and the warmth of fresh bread. She approached through the cemetery gates, her grey hair pinned neatly beneath a practical bonnet, her brown eyes holding the kind of understanding that comes from weathering loss. "Just paying my respects," Eli said, not turning from the headstone. "Sarah would tan your hide for neglecting your stock over her memory." Martha's tone was gentle but firm. She married a rancher, not a gravestone guardian. Eli finally turned, his weathered face creased with the beginning of a smile. "Reckon you're right, just hard some days. The hard days make the good ones sweeter." Martha fell into step beside him as they walked toward the cemetery gate. "Speaking of sweet, you seen McGraw's new stallion. Black as midnight and twice as ornery. Word is, he paid more for that horse than most folks see in 5 years. They paused at the gate, looking down toward the valley where McGraw's ranch sprawled like a small kingdom. Even from this distance, they could see the impressive corrals and outbuildings, the orderly arrangement of wealth and power. The stallion was there somewhere, another trophy in McGraw's collection. "Horse has a name?" Eli asked, though he wasn't sure why he cared. "Diablo. Fitting, from what I hear. Threw 6 cowboys already, broke 2 arms and a collarbone. McGraw's madder than a wet hen about it." Martha adjusted her shawl against the desert wind. "Pride's a funny thing. Sometimes it builds a man up, sometimes it tears him down." Eli nodded, understanding more about torn-down pride than he cared to admit. His own ranch had been hemorrhaging money since Sarah's death. Doctor bills, funeral costs, and 3 bad seasons had eaten through their savings like termites through dry wood. The bank held a note on his land that grew heavier each month, and Thomas Bradley at Copper Ridge Savings had started looking at him with the pitying expression reserved for drowning men. "You ever think about starting over?" Martha asked as they reached the main road. "Different place, different life. This is home," Eli said simply. "Sarah's buried here. My father built this ranch with his own hands. Starting over feels like giving up. Sometimes giving up is just good sense, and sometimes it's the only thing you got left to fight for." Martha studied his face, seeing something there that made her nod slowly. "Well, if you're determined to fight, you best make sure you got the strength for it. Can't win a battle on stubbornness alone." They parted ways at the crossroads, Martha heading back to town while Eli turned toward his ranch. The buildings came into view as he crested the small hill, the modest house he'd shared with Sarah, the barn that needed new shingles, the corrals that held his small herd. It wasn't much by McGraw's standards, but it was honest work built on honest ground. His cattle grazed in the far pasture, hardy stock bred for the harsh Arizona climate. They weren't prize winners, but they were survivors, much like their owner. Eli counted them automatically, checking for signs of illness or injury. 27 head, down from the 40 he'd started the year with. He'd sold 13 to pay down the banknote, but it barely made a dent in what he owed. The afternoon sun was slanting lower when he finished his chores and headed for town. Copper Ridge on Saturday afternoon buzzed with the kind of energy that came from hard-working folks gathering to share news and blow off steam. The main street stretched between false-fronted buildings that had seen better days, their paint faded, but their spirits intact. McGraw's voice carried from the Brass Dollar Saloon, loud and commanding as always. Through the batwing doors, Eli could see the man holding court at his usual table, surrounded by the kind of men who laughed at rich men's jokes, whether they were funny or not. McGraw's silver spurs caught the lamplight, throwing tiny rainbows across the saloon floor. Eli had no intention of going inside until he heard the words that would change everything. "No man alive can break that horse," McGraw was saying, his voice thick with whiskey and pride. "Hell, I'll bet my whole damn ranch on it. Every acre, every head of cattle, every building and fence post, any man who can sit that stallion for 10 minutes gets it all." The saloon fell silent. In a territory where land was everything and McGraw owned more of it than any man had a right to, such a bet was beyond reckless. It was insane. Eli pushed through the doors before he could change his mind. The ring on his finger felt heavy as lead, and Sarah's voice seemed to whisper in the desert wind, "Sometimes the biggest risk is not taking one at all." McGraw looked up as Eli approached, his pale eyes calculating and cold. Those silver spurs caught the light again, winking like stars in the smoky saloon air. "Well, well," McGraw said, his voice carrying across the silent room. "Look what the wind blew in." The leather-bound betting ledger sat open on McGraw's table like a book of conquests. Its pages were filled with neat entries, documenting years of wagers won, debts collected, and men humbled. McGraw kept meticulous records of every bet, every victory, every time someone had foolishly challenged his judgment and lost. The ledger was more than a record book. It was a testament to his superiority, proof that Silas McGraw never lost when the stakes were real. "You hear my offer, Boone?" McGraw's voice carried the lazy confidence of a man who'd never met his match. He traced a finger along the ledger's edge, already composing the entry that would record another man's defeat. "Or did you just come in to drink away your troubles like usual?" The insult stung because it held a grain of truth. Since Sarah's death, Eli had spent more evenings than he cared to admit nursing a single beer while trying to forget his mounting debts. But tonight felt different. Tonight, something in McGraw's arrogant certainty awakened a part of Eli that had been sleeping since the fever took his wife. "I heard you," Eli said, his voice steady despite the churning in his gut. "Whole ranch against any man who can ride your stallion for 10 minutes. "That's right." McGraw leaned back in his chair, silver spurs jangling softly. Though I should warn you, 6 good cowboys have tried already. Diablo put 2 in the doctor's office and sent the rest running with their tails between their legs. The men around McGraw's table chuckled obediently. They were his usual crowd men who owed him money or favors, who lived off his generosity like pilot fish following a shark. Their laughter had a nervous edge, as if they sensed something momentous in the smoky air. Eli looked around the saloon. Every face was turned toward him, eyes bright with curiosity and anticipation. In the corner, Martha Hendricks sat with the preacher's wife, her expression unreadable. Near the bar, Tom Bradley from the bank watched with the interest of a man calculating odds and potential foreclosures. 10 minutes, Eli repeated, more to himself than to McGraw. That's all? 10 minutes in the saddle without getting thrown. No ropes, no tricks, no help from anyone else. McGraw opened his ledger to a fresh page, dipping his pen in ink. Of course you'd need to put up something worth my time. What's a poor widower got to wager against the finest ranch in Arizona territory? The words hung in the air like smoke. Eli knew what McGraw was doing, publicly humiliating him, reminding everyone present of the vast difference in their stations. The smart play was to walk away, to tend his struggling ranch and accept his lot in life. The safe play was to remember that pride was a luxury he couldn't afford. But the wedding ring on his finger seemed to pulse with warmth, and he could almost hear Sarah's voice. Eli Boone, you were never one to take the safe road. Don't start now. I'll put up my ranch, he said quietly. The saloon erupted in murmurs and gasps. Men who'd been leaning against the bar straightened up, suddenly alert. Martha's hand flew to her throat. Even McGraw's cronies looked surprised. Your ranch? McGraw laughed, but there was something sharp in his eyes now. That patch of scrub and hardpan? Hell, Boone, my horse barn's worth more than your whole spread. Then you should be happy to take the bet. McGraw's pen paused over the ledger. For the first time since Eli had known him, the man looked uncertain. A bet was only satisfying if it proved your superiority, and there was no glory in crushing an ant. But refusing would look like weakness, and Silas McGraw had built his reputation on never backing down from a challenge. You're serious about this? McGraw asked. Dead serious. The saloon had gone so quiet that Eli could hear the clock ticking behind the bar. He thought about his father, who'd died breaking horses on that same land. He thought about Sarah, who'd believed in him when no one else would. He thought about the banknote that would come due in 3 months, and the choice between fighting for his home or watching it slip away piece by piece. McGraw dipped his pen again and began to write. Eli Boone's ranch and holdings against the McGraw estate. Winner, determined by whether challenger can ride the Stallion Diablo for 10 continuous minutes. He looked up. Witnessed by everyone here present. When? Eli asked. 1 week from today. Gives you time to write your will and say your prayers. McGraw blotted the ink carefully. Unless you want to change your mind. No shame in admitting you bit off more than you can chew. 1 week's fine. McGraw closed the ledger with a snap. Then we have ourselves a bet, gentlemen. 1 week from today, we'll see if poor Eli Boone has what it takes to ride the devil himself. The crowd began to disperse, men filing out into the night air, buzzing with excitement and speculation. By morning, word would spread to every ranch and settlement within 50 miles. By evening, side bets would be flowing like water, and odds would be calculated in every saloon and general store in the territory. Martha approached as Eli headed for the door. Her face was pale, her usual composure shaken. Eli, what have you done? What I had to do? That horse has nearly killed 6 men, good men, experienced riders. Maybe they were trying too hard. He touched the brim of his hat. Good night, Martha. Outside, the desert air was cool and clean after the saloon's smoky atmosphere. Stars wheeled overhead in patterns his father had taught him to read, the same constellations that had guided cowboys and dreamers across the vast Arizona landscape for generations. Eli walked slowly toward his horse, his mind already turning to the week ahead. He had 7 days to prepare for the ride of his life. 7 days to study a horse that had never been broken, to find a way where 6 better men had failed. 7 days to prove that sometimes the longest odds were the best ones to bet on. The wedding ring caught starlight as he gathered his reins. Win or lose, he was finally moving forward again. Sarah would have approved of that much, at least. Behind him, the brass dollar saloon glowed with lamplight and laughter. Inside, Silas McGraw was already calculating how he'd dispose of Eli's property once he won it. The betting ledger lay open to the fresh entry, ink still wet with a wager that would change both men's lives forever. Neither of them knew it yet, but the real contest wouldn't be between man and horse. It would be between 2 different ways of seeing the world, one built on dominance and fear, the other on patience and understanding. In the end, only one philosophy would prove strong enough to tame the devil in Diablo's heart. The rope coiled in Eli's hands like a sleeping snake, worn smooth by decades of honest work. It had belonged to his father, Samuel Boone, who'd taught him that a lariat was more than just braided leather and hemp. It was an extension of a man's will, his patience, his understanding of the creatures he worked with. The rope bore the patina of countless hours spent training horses, herding cattle, and learning the delicate balance between strength and gentleness that made a true horseman. Sunday morning found Eli examining the rope by lamplight, checking every strand for weakness, every knot for integrity. In 6 days, his life would change forever, one way or another. The smart money said he'd be broken and homeless by next Sunday evening, but the rope in his hands carried memories of his father's voice, steady and sure. "A horse ain't your enemy, son. He's just trying to figure out if you're worth trusting." News of the bet had spread faster than wildfire in drought season. By Sunday afternoon, riders were arriving in Copper Ridge from ranches 50 miles away, drawn by the spectacle of an impossible wager. The territorial newspaper had already sent a correspondent, a thin man with ink-stained fingers who took notes on everything and asked questions that made folks uncomfortable. At the Brass Dollar, betting pools sprouted like mushrooms after rain. Most money went on McGraw's horse, naturally, but a few sentimental souls placed small wagers on Eli out of sympathy or sheer contrarianism. The odds stood at 20-1 against him, which seemed generous to most observers. "You planning to train for this, or just show up and hope for miracles?" Martha asked as she restocked her shelves Monday morning. Her tone was casual, but worry lines creased her forehead. "Planning to get acquainted with the horse first," Eli replied, counting out coins for coffee and hardtack. "Can't ride what you don't understand. McGraw's not likely to let you near Diablo before Saturday. We'll see about that." Martha's hands stilled on a bolt of calico. "Eli Boone, please tell me you're not thinking of doing something foolish. More foolish than betting my ranch on a wild horse. Might be too late for that concern." The Monday afternoon ride to McGraw's spread gave Eli time to think and plan. The McGraw Ranch stretched across some of the finest grazing land in the territory, watered by 2 reliable streams and protected by natural rock formations that made it nearly self-contained. The main house sat on a low hill, a sprawling adobe structure with red tile roofs and wide verandas that spoke of wealth and permanence. The corrals lay beyond the house, a complex of sturdy poles and rails designed to contain the finest horseflesh money could buy. McGraw kept his prize animals there, mares bred for speed and beauty, stallions chosen for their bloodlines and temperament, and somewhere among them was Diablo, the horse that would determine Eli's fate. He found McGraw near the largest corral, leaning against the fence with the casual pose of a man surveying his kingdom. The rancher's silver spurs caught the afternoon light, throwing tiny reflections across the ground like scattered coins. "Come to beg off the bet, Boone." "Come to see the horse." McGraw's laugh was harsh as desert wind. "Hoping to find some weakness you can exploit? Some trick that'll give you an edge? Just want to understand what I'm facing." "What you're facing is 16 hands of pure hellfire, but go ahead, take a look. Won't change anything come Saturday." Diablo stood alone in the center corral, isolated from the other horses by necessity rather than choice. He was magnificent, coal-black from nose to tail, with a mane that caught the wind like a battle flag. His conformation was perfect, the kind of horse that appeared in dreams and legends, but his eyes held something that made Eli's chest tighten with recognition. They were the eyes of a creature that had known pain, betrayal, disappointment. The same look Eli saw in his own mirror some mornings, the expression of something wounded that had learned to strike first rather than risk being hurt again. The stallion paced the corral's perimeter, muscles rippling under his ebony coat, magnificent in his fury and isolation. "Beautiful, isn't he?" McGraw said with obvious pride. "Paid 3,000 for him, sight unseen. Seller claimed he was just spirited, needed the right hand. Turned out he was a damn liar. Where'd he come from?" "Ranch down in Sonora. Owner died. Estate sale. Horse came with papers showing champion bloodlines, perfect for breeding." McGraw spat in the dust. "Perfect for breaking Cowboy's bones is more like it." Eli studied the horse's movement, noting the way Diablo shied from the corral fence whenever someone approached. Most horses, even wild ones, showed some curiosity about humans. Diablo showed only suspicion and barely contained rage. Anyone tried gentling him instead of breaking him. "Gentling?" McGraw's voice dripped contempt. "That horse needs to learn who's boss, not get coddled like a pet. I had Buck Morrison work with him for 3 weeks, best bronc rider in Arizona. Diablo put him in bed for a month." Eli remembered his father's words about horses like this one. "Some came to you broken by cruelty, their spirits twisted by harsh treatment and harder men. They fought not from wildness but from fear, striking out at a world that had taught them that humans meant pain and domination." "I'd like to spend some time with him this week," Eli said. "Get him used to me before Saturday." McGraw's eyes narrowed. "That wasn't part of the bet. Wasn't excluded either. You want this to be a fair test, don't you?" The question hung between them like smoke. McGraw had built his reputation on being unbeatable, untouchable, always one step ahead of lesser men. But fairness was a concept that made him uncomfortable, like an ill-fitting shirt or a saddle that didn't sit right. "You can look all you want," he said finally, "but if you get hurt, that's on you. And if you try any tricks, any funny business, the bet's off and you forfeit. Understood?" Eli spent the rest of the afternoon leaning against the corral fence, watching Diablo's patterns. The horse was intelligent, that much was clear. He'd learned the boundaries of his prison and tested them regularly, looking for weaknesses. When the sun started its descent toward the western mountains, Eli noticed something that made his pulse quicken. For just a moment, when the light hit at the right angle, Diablo stopped pacing and looked directly at him. Not with the wild aggression Eli had expected, but with something that might have been curiosity. It lasted only seconds before the horse resumed his restless patrol, but it was enough. That evening, back at his own ranch, Eli sat on his porch with his father's rope coiled beside him. The leather felt familiar in his hands, carrying the weight of memory and tradition. Samuel Boone had never met a horse he couldn't gentle, though he'd made plenty of mistakes learning how. The rope had been part of those lessons, witness to both failures and triumphs. "Patience, son," his father used to say. "A horse will tell you everything you need to know if you're willing to listen. Most men are too busy talking to hear what the horse is trying to say." The stars came out one by one, the same constellations that had watched over generations of cowboys and their horses. Somewhere across the valley, Diablo stood alone in his corral, magnificent and misunderstood. In 5 days, one of them would learn something about the other. Eli just hoped they'd both survive the lesson. Sarah's quilt lay folded at the foot of Eli's bed, its wedding ring pattern worked in blues and whites that had faded to the color of worn denim and old snow. She'd started it during their first winter together, when the adobe walls were thin against the cold, and they'd huddled beneath whatever blankets they could find. Each evening, by lamplight, she'd added another piece, her needle moving with the patience of a woman who understood that the best things took time to create. "Love can't be rushed," she used to say, holding up a completed square to catch the light. "You push too hard, try to force the pieces together, and the whole thing falls apart. But you take your time, match the edges careful-like, and you get something that'll last." Tuesday morning found Eli standing before the quilt, running his fingers along its intricate stitches. In 4 days, everything he owned would be on the line, including the bed this quilt had warmed for 7 precious years. But tonight, wrapped in Sarah's handiwork, he'd felt closer to understanding what needed to happen with Diablo. The horse was like a torn quilt, he realized. All the pieces were there, the intelligence, the strength, the noble spirit, but they'd been forced together wrong, sewn with harsh hands and rougher methods. What he needed wasn't to break Diablo, but to help him remember how the pieces were supposed to fit. The morning ride to McGraw's ranch had become routine. Eli would arrive shortly after dawn, when the desert air was still cool and the shadows stretched long across the corrals. McGraw's cowboys went about their business with the careful indifference of men who knew their boss was watching, but Eli caught them glancing his way when they thought he wasn't looking. Some faces showed sympathy, others curiosity, but most reflected the resigned acceptance of men who'd learned not to bet against Silas McGraw. Diablo stood in his usual spot at the corral center, head high and ears pricked forward. He'd grown accustomed to Eli's daily visits, though he still maintained his wary distance. Progress, of a sort. The kind of progress Sarah would have recognized and approved of, slow, patient, built on respect rather than dominance. "Still planning to ride that devil?" The voice belonged to Jake Munson, one of McGraw's top hands. He was a good cowboy by all accounts, skilled with rope and horse, but there was something in his eyes that reminded Eli of his boss, a hardness that came from believing strength was the only currency that mattered. "Planning to try." "You know he killed a man down in Sonora? That's why the estate was so eager to sell him. Kicked a vaquero in the head, split his skull like a melon." Eli looked at Jake carefully. "That true, or just talk?" "True as Sunday morning, ask anyone who was there." Jake spat tobacco juice into the dirt. "Course, McGraw don't advertise that particular detail. Bad for the horse's reputation, you might say." The revelation should have been terrifying, but instead it filled Eli with something approaching sadness. Another piece of the puzzle that was Diablo's pain. He'd been pushed so hard, treated so roughly, that his spirit had snapped like an overtaxed rope. The vaquero's death was a tragedy, but it was also a warning sign that everyone had chosen to ignore. "Appreciate the information," Eli said. "Don't suppose it'll change your mind?" "No. But it helps me understand what I'm dealing with." Jake shook his head and walked away, leaving Eli alone with the horse who'd killed a man. But when Diablo looked his way, Eli didn't see a killer. He saw an animal in pain, lashing out at a world that had taught him violence was the only language humans understood. That afternoon brought visitors to Copper Ridge, like iron filings to a magnet. Cowboys from distant ranches, townspeople from settlements a day's ride away, even a few well-dressed gentlemen who claimed to be investors but looked more like gamblers, following the scent of long odds and easy money. The brass dollar ran out of rooms, forcing late arrivals to pitch tents on the outskirts of town or sleep in their saddles. Martha's general store did a booming business in supplies and gossip. Men who'd never spoken to each other struck up conversations about horses and odds, while their wives clustered around Martha's counter, hungry for details about the bet that had the whole territory talking. "You seen him lately?" asked Mrs. Patterson, the banker's wife. Her voice carried the breathless excitement of a woman unaccustomed to genuine drama. "Eli, I mean. How does he look?" "Like a man with something on his mind," Martha replied diplomatically. "I heard McGraw's horse has killed 6 men," whispered Alice Thornton, the preacher's daughter, "trampled them to death and ate their bones." "Now that's just foolishness," Martha said firmly. "It's a horse, not a mountain lion." But the stories grew with each telling, as stories do. By evening, Diablo had become a creature of legend, part horse, part demon, wholly unstoppable. The odds against Eli climbed to 30-1, then 40, as more money poured in to back what seemed like the surest bet in Arizona territory. That evening, as the sun painted the desert in shades of gold and crimson, Eli returned to the McGraw Ranch for one final visit before Wednesday's trial run. McGraw was nowhere to be seen, probably holding court at the Brass Dollar, but Diablo waited in his corral, as always. The horse seemed different tonight, less agitated, more alert. He watched Eli approach with what might have been recognition, though he maintained his careful distance. When Eli spoke in the low, gentle tones his father had taught him, Diablo's ears swiveled forward, catching every word. "Easy, boy. I know you've had it rough. I know people have hurt you, pushed you too hard, expected too much." Eli's voice carried across the evening air like a prayer. "But I'm not here to break you. I'm here to see if maybe we can help each other out." Diablo snorted and tossed his head, but he didn't retreat. A small victory, but Eli had learned to treasure small victories. They were often the foundation upon which larger ones were built. The ride home took him past the cemetery where Sarah lay buried. Eli stopped at her grave, as had become his custom, and sat in the gathering darkness with his hat in his hands. The wedding ring quilt was waiting at home, and tomorrow would bring another day closer to Saturday's reckoning. "I know this seems crazy," he said to the headstone, "betting everything on a horse that's never been rode. But I keep thinking about what you used to say about patience, about taking time to do things right. Maybe that's what he needs. Maybe that's what we both need." The desert wind stirred the sagebrush and carried the distant sound of laughter from town. Somewhere in that celebration of anticipated violence, Silas McGraw was probably regaling his audience with stories of past victories, adding embellishments to make himself look better and his opponents look worse. The silver spurs would be flashing in the lamplight, marking time until Saturday's showdown. But here in the quiet cemetery, with Sarah's memory for company and the quilt waiting at home, Eli felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Hope. Not the desperate hope of a drowning man, but the steady confidence of someone who'd finally found his direction. Win or lose, he was moving forward again. The quilt had taught him that much. Sometimes the most beautiful patterns emerged from the most unlikely pieces, if you had the patience to see how they fit together. 4 days to go, and counting. The town bell began ringing at dawn on Wednesday, its bronze voice carrying across Copper Ridge like a herald of momentous events. The bell had been cast in Philadelphia and hauled across 2,000 miles of wilderness to mark the town's founding 20 years earlier. It rang for births and deaths, for fires and floods, for celebrations and sorrows. Today, it rang for a different reason, to announce that in 3 days the impossible would be attempted. Eli heard the bell from his kitchen, where coffee steamed in a chipped ceramic mug and yesterday's bread lay crumbled on a tin plate. He'd slept poorly despite Sarah's quilt, his dreams filled with images of black horses and silver spurs, of crowds cheering and women weeping. The bell's insistent calling seemed to echo the growing weight of expectation that pressed down on him like summer heat. By the time he reached town, Main Street looked like a county fair had collided with a traveling circus. Wagons lined the street 3 deep, their owners having claimed spots for Saturday's spectacle. Enterprising locals had set up booths selling food and drink, while gamblers worked the crowds with cards and dice and promises of easy money. The territorial newspaperman had been joined by writers from papers in Tucson and Phoenix, their notebooks filled with colorful descriptions of the coming contest. "Eli, over here." The voice belonged to Preacher Williams, a thin man with kind eyes and the patient demeanor of someone accustomed to ministering to stubborn congregations. He stood beside Martha near the church steps, both of them looking concerned but determined to show support. "Quite a circus you've started," Martha said as Eli approached. "Wasn't exactly my intention." "Never is, with things like this." The preacher studied Eli's face with the practiced eye of a man who'd counseled troubled souls for 30 years. "You sleeping all right? Eating proper? A man needs his strength for what you're attempting. I'm managing. Managing and thriving are two different states of being." Martha's voice carried the gentle authority of a woman who'd raised 4 children and buried 2 husbands. "You look like you've lost weight, and you can't afford to lose an ounce." The bell rang again, shorter pulls this time, as if whoever was operating it had grown tired of the constant noise. But the damage was done. More people streamed into town with each passing hour, drawn by the promise of witnessing either a miracle or a spectacular failure. "Word spread clear to California," said Tom Bradley, approaching from the bank with a ledger tucked under his arm. "Got a telegram from San Francisco yesterday. Some rich fellow wants to bet $5,000 on McGraw's horse." He paused meaningfully. "Course. He's also asking about your note, wondering if it might be available for purchase should things go badly Saturday." The implication hung in the desert air like dust after a cattle drive. If Eli lost, his debts would become someone else's asset, his land absorbed into a larger empire before the dust had settled on his defeat. "Appreciate the warning, Tom." "Wasn't warning exactly, just information." Bradley shifted uncomfortably. "You know I'm pulling for you, Eli. Always have been. But business is business, and that note's got to be paid one way or another." After Bradley left, Martha took Eli's arm and guided him away from the crowd. Her grip was gentle but firm, the touch of a woman who'd comforted grieving families and celebrated with newlyweds, who understood the full weight of human hopes and fears. "There's something else," she said quietly. "Something you should know before Saturday." They walked to the edge of town, where the desert began its endless stretch toward distant mountains. Here the noise of the crowd faded to a manageable murmur, replaced by the whisper of wind through sage and the distant cry of a hawk circling high overhead. "McGraw came by the store yesterday evening," Martha continued. "Had a few drinks in him, talking loud about the bet. But what troubled me was what he said about you. Nothing he says troubles me much anymore. He called you a broken-down widower playing with money he don't have. Said you'd been drinking yourself to death since Sarah passed, and this bet was just another way of giving up." Martha's voice was steady, but her eyes flashed with anger. "But then he said something else. Said he'd make sure you got hurt bad enough that you'd never forget your place again." Eli felt something cold settle in his stomach. "Hurt how?" "Didn't say exactly, but the way he talked, like he was planning more than just watching you get thrown by a horse." They stood in silence for a moment, watching the crowd surge and flow through Copper Ridge's streets. Somewhere in that mass of humanity, Silas McGraw was holding court, his silver spurs catching light and attention in equal measure. The man who'd built an empire on other people's failures was preparing to add another trophy to his collection. "You could still back out," Martha said softly. "No shame in admitting the stakes are too high. There's shame in not trying when trying's all you got left. And if he's planning something underhanded, then I'll deal with it when it happens." Eli touched the brim of his hat. "Right now, I need to go see about a horse." The afternoon visit to McGraw's ranch revealed changes that made Eli's skin crawl with unease. Extra cowboys lounged around the corrals, men he didn't recognize with hard faces and the casual violence of hired guns. They watched him approach with the lazy attention of cats observing a mouse, their hands never far from the weapons at their sides. McGraw stood near Diablo's corral, resplendent in a new vest adorned with silver buttons that matched his famous spurs. His smile was wide and predatory, the expression of a man who'd spotted weakness and intended to exploit it. "Come for your final look, Boone? Getting nervous about Saturday? Just keeping to my routine." "Routine's important for a man facing his doom." McGraw gestured toward the extra cowboys. "Had to bring in some help for the big day. Lot of money changing hands, lot of important people coming to watch. Can't have any trouble spoiling the festivities." The message was clear as desert sky. These weren't ordinary ranch hands brought in to handle crowds. They were enforcers, insurance policies against the unlikely possibility that Eli might actually succeed. McGraw hadn't built his empire by leaving things to chance, and he wasn't about to start now. But when Eli looked at Diablo, he saw something that made his heart quicken with possibility. The horse was watching him intently, ears forward, body language suggesting curiosity rather than aggression. It was subtle, the kind of change that most people would miss entirely. But Eli had spent 30 years reading horses, and what he saw in Diablo's dark eyes was the beginning of trust. "Beautiful animal," said a voice behind him. One of McGraw's new men had approached, a lean fellow with pale eyes and scars on his knuckles. "Shame he's got such a nasty temperament. Heard he killed a man down in Mexico. So I'm told. Course, accidents happen all the time around horses. Big, powerful animals like that man could get kicked in the head, trampled underfoot. Real tragedy, but nothing anyone could prevent." The man's smile was thin as a knife blade. "Just want to make sure you understand the risks you're taking." Eli met the man's stare without flinching. "I understand them fine." "Good. Wouldn't want any misunderstandings come Saturday." That evening, as the sun painted the western sky in shades of orange and gold, Eli sat on his porch with his father's rope coiled beside him. The town bell had finally fallen silent, but the sounds of celebration still carried across the valley, laughter and music, the clink of bottles and coins, the voice of a territory convinced it was about to witness something spectacular. But here in the gathering dusk, with Sarah's quilt waiting inside and the memory of trust in a wild horse's eyes, Eli felt a different kind of anticipation. Not the bloodthirsty excitement of a crowd hungry for violence, but the quiet confidence of a man who'd finally found his purpose again. 3 days to go, and the real contest was just beginning. The scars on Diablo's hide told stories that no man should have to read. They were there if you knew how to look faint lines across his flanks, where spurs had raked too deep, white marks on his shoulders from ropes pulled too tight, and most telling of all, the network of thin scars around his muzzle, where a harsh bit had been forced and twisted until the proud head learned to submit or suffer greater pain. Thursday morning found Eli studying these marks with the careful attention of a doctor examining symptoms. Each scar was a chapter in a book of cruelty, a record of men who believed that breaking a horse's spirit was the same as earning its respect. The wonder wasn't that Diablo had become dangerous, it was that he'd retained any spark of nobility at all. "Ugly, ain't it?" McGraw's voice carried across the corral like the crack of a whip. He'd approached quietly, those silver spurs making no sound on the packed earth. Previous owner claimed the horse came that way, but I suspect otherwise. Some men are too free with their hands, if you know what I mean. The casual admission made Eli's stomach turn. Here was a man looking at evidence of systematic abuse and feeling nothing but mild annoyance at damaged property. It explained much about McGraw's character, and even more about why Diablo had learned to fight every human who came near. "Must have been painful," Eli said quietly. "For the horse? I suppose. But pain teaches lessons, and some lessons can't be learned gentle-like." McGraw's pale eyes studied Eli's face. "You getting soft-hearted about the beast? Thinking maybe you can love him into submission? Thinking maybe there's more than one way to get a job done? There's the right way and the wrong way, Boone. Right way produces results. Wrong way gets you hurt." McGraw gestured toward his assembled cowboys, still lounging around the corrals like well-dressed vultures. "Course, you'll find out Saturday which approach works better." But McGraw was wrong about one thing. Pain hadn't taught Diablo lessons. It had taught him survival. The difference was crucial, though most people never bothered to make the distinction. A lesson implied learning and growth. Survival was simply endurance, the basic animal instinct to keep breathing no matter the cost. That afternoon brought Martha to Eli's ranch, riding side saddle on her reliable bay mare with the easy competence of a woman who'd been managing on her own for years. She carried a covered basket that smelled of fresh bread and something that might have been apple pie. Comfort food, for a man who looked like he'd forgotten the concept entirely. "Thought you might be hungry," she said, settling onto his porch with the efficient movements of someone accustomed to making herself useful. "Also thought you might want some company that wasn't trying to talk you out of Saturday or into your grave." They ate in companionable silence, watching the sun track across the desert sky. The bread was still warm, the pie sweet with cinnamon and memories of better times. Eli found himself eating more than he had in days, his body responding to nourishment. He'd been denying it in his preoccupation with the coming challenge. "You know," Martha said eventually, "I've been thinking about what you're attempting. Not the horse-riding part, but the bigger picture. What it means. What's it mean to you?" "Means a man deciding to fight for something instead of just letting it slip away." She cut another slice of pie with the precise movements of a woman who'd spent years making portions stretch. "Been a lot of slipping away lately, farms failing, families moving on, dreams getting smaller every year. Nice to see someone pushing back against that tide." The observation touched something deep in Eli's chest, a recognition of truth he'd been avoiding. This wasn't really about a horse or a bet or even a ranch. It was about choosing to stand up when everything inside you wanted to lie down and quit. It was about Sarah's quilt and his father's rope and the accumulated weight of every moment that had led him to this choice. "What if I can't do it?" he asked. "What if all this faith you're showing is misplaced? Then you'll have tried something worth trying, and that'll be enough." Martha's voice carried the certainty of a woman who'd buried 2 husbands and raised 4 children, and still believed in the possibility of good outcomes. Better to fail at something important than succeed at something meaningless. That evening, as Martha prepared to leave, she paused at her horse and turned back to face him. "There's something else you should know. About McGraw and his extra men. I figured they weren't here for decoration. Word around town is they've got orders to make sure the horse throws you hard. Real hard. Accidentally, of course." Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled slightly as she gathered the reins. "People are saying McGraw's got too much riding on this bet to leave it to chance." "People say a lot of things. This isn't gossip, Eli. This is warning." Martha's eyes held the fierce protectiveness of a mother hen defending her chicks. "That man's built his whole life on never losing, and he's not about to start now. You be careful Saturday. You be more than careful." After she'd ridden away, Eli sat on his porch with his father's rope across his knees and Sarah's memory for company. 2 days until Saturday, and the stakes kept climbing higher than any reasonable man should accept. But somewhere across the valley, a scarred black horse was probably looking toward the sunset and wondering if tomorrow would bring more pain or something different. The answer to that question would determine both their futures. Friday morning dawned clear and hot, the kind of day that made the desert shimmer with mirages and false promises. Eli rode to McGraw's ranch one final time, past the growing encampments of spectators and the improvised betting parlors that had sprouted like toadstools after rain. Money was flowing like water, most of it betting against him, but he'd stopped caring about odds and opinions. Diablo stood waiting in his corral, magnificent and isolated as always. But when Eli approached the fence, something remarkable happened. The horse walked toward him slowly, carefully, but with clear intent. They stood separated by wooden rails and years of accumulated mistrust, man and horse, studying each other with the intensity of chess masters contemplating a crucial move. "Easy, boy," Eli said softly. "I know you've been hurt. I know you've learned not to trust. But tomorrow we're going to try something different. Tomorrow we're going to see if understanding works better than force." Diablo's ears swiveled forward, catching every word. For just a moment, the wildness left his eyes, replaced by something that might have been hope. It was the look of a creature who'd forgotten what kindness felt like, but was willing to remember, given the chance. One day to go, and everything would change. The brand was hidden beneath thick black hair on Diablo's shoulder, invisible unless you knew exactly where to look and had the patience to part the coarse strands with gentle fingers. It was an old brand, partially healed over and deliberately obscured, but still readable to eyes that understood the language of cattle marks and property claims. The symbol wasn't McGraw's ornate SM that marked his other stock. It was a simple circle R, burned deep into the hide years ago by hands that had loved this horse before the world turned cruel. Friday evening had brought Eli to the corral for what everyone assumed would be his final visit before Saturday's reckoning. McGraw was nowhere to be seen, probably holding court at the Brass Dollar and accepting congratulations for a victory not yet won. His hired men lounged in whatever shade they could find, their attention focused on bottles and cards rather than the lone figure standing beside the Black Stallion's pen. The discovery of the brand changed everything. Eli's hands trembled as he traced the faded circle R with his fingertip. He knew that mark, had seen it burned into the hides of some of the finest horses in Arizona territory. Robert Cassidy had registered the brand 15 years ago when he'd established his ranch in the mountains north of Flagstaff. The Cassidy spread had been famous for breeding horses with perfect conformation and gentle temperaments, animals that combined beauty with intelligence in ways that made other ranchers weep with envy. But the Cassidy ranch was gone now, had been for 3 years. A mysterious fire had destroyed the main buildings, killing Robert and his wife in their sleep. Their son Michael had tried to keep the operation going, but financial difficulties, some said deliberately engineered by competitors, had forced him to sell everything and move east. The horses had been scattered to the winds, sold at auction to buyers who cared more about price than pedigree. If Diablo bore the Circle R brand, it meant he'd been stolen from that auction, or worse, stolen before it, taken while the Cassidy family grieved their losses and struggled to salvage something from the ashes of their dreams. It meant McGraw's legitimate purchase from a Sonora estate sale was built on lies and theft. It meant the horse's violent behavior wasn't natural wildness, but the traumatic response of an animal ripped from everything familiar and thrust into a world of cruelty. "Son of a bitch," Eli whispered, and Diablo's ears flicked toward the sound of human voice. The pieces fell into place like tumblers in a lock clicking open. McGraw's nervousness about the bet, despite his public confidence. The convenient story about buying the horse site unseen from a dead man's estate. The systematic abuse that had turned a gentle, intelligent animal into a creature everyone feared. It wasn't just theft, it was the destruction of something beautiful for the sake of profit and power. But theft could be proven, if a man was brave enough and smart enough to gather the right evidence. That night, Eli rode hard toward Flagstaff, pushing his horse through darkness, guided only by starlight and desperation. The journey took him through country he hadn't visited in years, past the burned-out remains of the Cassidy Ranch and into the town where Robert Cassidy had registered his brand and kept his business records. If those records still existed, they would show the registration numbers of every horse bearing the Circle R, including the animal now called Diablo. The county clerk's office was closed, naturally, but Eli knew the clerk, a thin, nervous man named Henderson, who owed him a favor from years past. A few thrown pebbles against the right window brought Henderson to his door in nightshirt and slippers, grumbling about the hour and the impropriety of conducting business after midnight. "This better be life and death, Boone." "Might be, at that." Henderson's complaints died when Eli explained what he needed. The clerk disappeared into his files and emerged 20 minutes later with a leather-bound ledger that contained the registration records for the Circle R brand. The pages were yellowed with age and smudged with ink, but the information was clear and damning. "Here," Henderson said, pointing to an entry halfway down the page. "Registered in 1878 to Robert Cassidy. Black Stallion, white star on forehead, 16 hands high. Registration number 4127. He looked up at Eli with growing excitement. You saying McGraw's got this horse? I'm saying someone does, and it wasn't bought legal from any estate sale. Well, I'll be damned. Henderson made careful copies of the relevant pages, his thin fingers shaking with either cold or anticipation. You know what this means? Means tomorrow's going to be more interesting than anyone expected. The ride back to Copper Ridge took place in the grey hour before dawn, when the desert held its breath and waited for the sun to paint the world in colours beyond imagination. Eli carried Henderson's copies in his shirt pocket, folded carefully and protected against sweat and weather. The papers would prove Diablo's true identity and McGraw's crime, but they would also destroy any chance of Saturday's contest taking place as planned. The question that haunted him during that long ride was whether justice was worth more than the chance to save his ranch through honest competition. By the time he reached Copper Ridge, the town was already stirring with pre-dawn activity. Cook fires blazed in the temporary camps, and early risers moved through the streets like ghosts preparing for a resurrection. The air hummed with anticipation and the promise of violence, the collective breath of a crowd gathered to witness something they hoped would be spectacular. Martha was waiting on his porch, wrapped in a shawl and holding a steaming cup of coffee, like a talisman against the morning chill. "Wondered where you'd gotten to," she said. "Saw you ride out last night like the devil was chasing you." Maybe he was. Eli dismounted and tied his horse to the porch rail. "Martha, I need to tell you something that changes everything." He told her about the brand, about the records, about the proof of theft that rode in his shirt pocket like a loaded gun. She listened without interruption, her face growing pale as the implications became clear. "My God," she whispered when he finished, "you're saying McGraw stole that horse?" "I'm saying the horse was stolen, and McGraw knew it when he bought him. Makes him guilty of receiving stolen property at minimum, maybe conspiracy if he was involved in the original theft. What are you going to do?" That was the question that had tormented him during the long ride home. He could expose McGraw, prove the man's criminality, maybe even see justice done for the Cassidy family's losses. But doing so would end the bet, cancel Saturday's contest, and leave him exactly where he'd started, broke, desperate, and facing foreclosure on his ranch. Or he could stay silent, ride the horse as planned, and hope that 10 minutes in the saddle would be enough to win back his future. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I truly don't know." The sun crested the eastern mountains as they sat in silence, painting Copper Ridge in shades of gold and promise. Somewhere across town, Silas McGraw was probably waking up in his grand house, confident that this day would add another victory to his collection. His silver spurs would catch the morning light, and his betting ledger would record another man's defeat. But in his shirt pocket, Eli carried the power to change everything. The only question was whether he had the courage to use it. McGraw's ornate saddle sat on the corral fence like a throne awaiting its king, its leather polished to mirror brightness, and its silver conchos catching the morning sun like scattered stars. It was a beautiful piece of craftsmanship, hand-tooled by master artisans and worth more than most men earned in a year. Every line spoke of dominance, of the belief that control came through force and submission through fear. The high cantle and deep seat were designed to keep a rider secure, no matter how violent the horse's protests, while the elaborate bit and martingale promised to impose human will through pain and pressure. It was everything wrong with the relationship between man and horse, distilled into expensive leather and precious metal. Saturday morning had dawned clear and merciless, the kind of day when the desert showed no quarter to the weak or unprepared. By sunrise, the crowd had swollen to over 300 souls, representing every ranch, town, and settlement within 100 miles. They came in wagons and on horseback, on foot and by stage, drawn by the promise of witnessing something that would be talked about for generations. The betting had reached frenzied proportions. Tom Bradley's bank had run out of cash to cover the wagers, forcing him to send an urgent telegram to Phoenix for additional funds. The odds had stabilized at 50-1 against Eli, making him the longest shot in Arizona Territory history. A few sentimental souls had put down small amounts on the hometown underdog, but the smart money flowed like water toward McGraw's inevitable victory. Eli stood apart from the crowd, checking his father's rope with the methodical care of a man preparing for surgery. Each strand was inspected, each knot tested, each coil arranged with precision, born of 30 years' experience. The rope would be crucial today, not for roping Diablo, but for something far more delicate and dangerous. Still going through with this madness? Preacher Williams approached, his face lined with concern and his Bible clutched in hands that shook with age and worry. It's not too late to call it off, you know. No shame in admitting when the odds are too long. Appreciate the concern, preacher, but some things are worth the risk. Your life? Your soul? What's worth gambling those away? Eli looked across the crowd toward McGraw's spread, where Diablo waited in his corral like a prisoner awaiting execution. The horse had been moved to a smaller pen for the contest, surrounded by temporary bleachers that groaned under the weight of eager spectators. From this distance, he looked like a dark smudge against the brown earth, but Eli knew the magnificent animal was aware of every eye upon him, every voice raised in speculation about his nature. "Sometimes a man has to stand up," Eli said quietly. "Sometimes that's all that's left." Martha appeared at his elbow, carrying a cloth bundle that smelled of herbs and clean linen. Her face was pale but determined, the expression of a woman who'd made peace with circumstances beyond her control. "Brought you some bandages," she said, "and some of Doc Patterson's pain powders, in case you need them after." "After I get thrown, you mean?" "After you do whatever fool thing you're planning to do." Her eyes held a mixture of fear and fierce affection that made Eli's chest tighten. "I don't pretend to understand what's driving you, but I know you well enough to recognize that look. You've got something in mind, besides just climbing on that horse." She was right, of course. The papers from Henderson rode in his shirt pocket, proof of McGraw's crimes and Diablo's true identity. But alongside them was something else, a different plan, born of desperation and nurtured by the growing understanding between man and horse. It was a plan that might save his ranch and expose McGraw's criminality in one explosive moment, if he had the courage to see it through. "Whatever happens," he said, taking the bandages, "I want you to know that these past few days, having someone believe in me, it's meant more than I can say." Martha's hand found his arm, her touch warm and steady. "You're not alone in this, Eli Boone. Remember that when things get difficult." The crowd was moving toward McGraw's ranch, a river of humanity flowing across the desert like water finding its course. Eli joined the stream, his father's rope coiled over his shoulder and his heart hammering against his ribs. The proof of McGraw's crimes rode next to his heart, while the weight of his own desperate gamble pressed down like summer heat. At the ranch, temporary corrals had been constructed to give everyone a clear view of the contest. McGraw held court from a raised platform that had been built overnight, his silver spurs flashing as he gestured to the crowd. His hired men were positioned strategically around the corral, their hands never far from their weapons, and their eyes never far from Eli. "Ladies and gentlemen," McGraw's voice carried across the assembly like the crack of a whip. "Welcome to what promises to be the most spectacular contest in Arizona Territory history. Today we'll see whether man or beast reigns supreme, whether civilization can tame the wild heart that beats in every untamed creature." The crowd roared approval, their bloodlust rising like heat from sun-baked stone. They'd come to see violence, to witness the humbling of a man who dared reach above his station. The fact that lives and futures hung in the balance only added spice to their entertainment. Diablo waited in the center corral, surrounded by wooden rails and human expectations. He paced the perimeter with the restless energy of a caged storm, his black coat gleaming with sweat and tension. But when his eyes found Eli in the crowd, something changed in his posture. The wild rage flickered, replaced by something that might have been recognition, or hope, or simply the acknowledgement that his fate was tied to the weathered man with gentle hands. "The rules are simple," McGraw continued, his voice rising with theatrical drama. "Our challenger must mount the horse and remain in the saddle for 10 continuous minutes. No ropes, no assistance, no tricks of any kind. If he succeeds, he wins my entire ranch. If he fails," McGraw's smile was sharp as a knife blade, "well, we all know what happens when you bet more than you can afford to lose." The crowd laughed, the sound harsh and hungry. They'd wagered heavily on this outcome, and they wanted their entertainment before claiming their winnings. Eli stepped forward, his father's rope heavy in his hands, and the proof of McGraw's crimes burning against his chest. The moment of decision had arrived: expose the truth and lose his chance, or risk everything on 10 minutes with a horse that had killed a man and broken 6 others. But as he looked into Diablo's dark eyes, he saw something that made his choice clear. The horse was waiting for him, trusting him, believing that this man might be different from all the others who'd brought only pain and disappointment. Some things were worth more than justice. Some bonds transcended revenge. Eli began walking toward the corral, and the crowd fell silent with anticipation. His father's hat sat on Eli's head like a benediction, the worn felt soft with age and shaped by decades of honest work beneath the Arizona sun. Samuel Boone had worn this hat through good times and bad, through cattle drives and horse breaking, through the building of a life and the passing of it on to his son. The crown bore the dents and stains of a working man's life, while the brim had been shaped by hands that understood the value of shade in desert country. Wearing it now felt like carrying his father's blessing into the most important moment of his life. The crowd pressed against the corral rails with the intensity of spectators at a gladiatorial contest, their faces flushed with excitement and bloodlust. 300 souls had gathered to witness what they expected would be a spectacular failure, the humbling of a man who dared challenge the natural order of things. Money changed hands in final wagers as Eli approached the gate, most of it betting on how quickly he'd be thrown and how badly he'd be hurt. McGraw stood on his platform like an emperor, surveying his domain, resplendent in his finest clothes and shiniest spurs. His betting ledger lay open beside him, ready to record another victory in his long campaign of domination. The silver conchos on his belt caught the sun and threw tiny rainbows across the packed earth, beautiful and cold as winter stars. "Well, Boone?" McGraw's voice carried across the suddenly silent crowd. "You ready to learn what happens when a man bites off more than he can chew?" Eli paused at the corral gate, his father's rope coiled in his left hand and his heart hammering against the proof of McGraw's crimes tucked in his shirt pocket. For a moment that stretched like eternity, he considered pulling out Henderson's papers and exposing the truth about Diablo's stolen identity. Justice demanded it. The Cassidy family deserved it. The law required it. But when he looked at the magnificent black horse waiting in the center of the corral, he saw something that made his decision clear. Diablo stood perfectly still, his dark eyes fixed on Eli with an intensity that spoke of understanding, of trust carefully offered and hopefully received. This wasn't about justice anymore, or revenge, or even winning a bet. This was about the bond between two creatures who'd found each other in their brokenness and chosen to stand together. "I'm ready," Eli said, and stepped through the gate. The corral fell silent, except for the whisper of desert wind and the soft shuffle of Diablo's hooves on packed earth. The crowd held its collective breath, 300 people suddenly aware they were witnessing something beyond mere entertainment. This felt different, charged with an electricity that made the air shimmer like heat mirages. Eli walked slowly toward the center of the corral, his movements deliberate and calm. He held his father's rope loosely, not as a weapon or tool of dominance, but as a bridge between past wisdom and present need. Each step brought him closer to the horse that had killed one man and broken 6 others, the creature everyone said could never be tamed. But Eli wasn't planning to tame Diablo. He was planning to partner with him. "Easy, boy," he said softly, his voice carrying the gentle authority his father had taught him. "I know you're scared. I know you've been hurt. But we're going to try something different today." Diablo's ears swiveled forward, catching every word. The wild tension in his muscles eased fractionally, replaced by something that might have been curiosity. He'd heard hundreds of human voices over the years, shouting, cursing, commanding, but this one carried something different. This one carried respect. The crowd began to murmur as Eli approached within 10 feet of the horse without incident. Most had expected an immediate explosion of violence, the kind of spectacular collision that would send man flying and horse rearing in triumph. Instead, they witnessed something unprecedented. Diablo actually taking a step toward the human who'd entered his domain. "What's he doing?" someone whispered. "Why ain't the horse attacking? This ain't natural." McGraw's face had gone pale beneath his expensive hat. His silver spurs jingled nervously as he shifted his weight, suddenly aware that his sure-thing bet might not be as certain as he'd believed. The hired guns he'd positioned around the corral moved closer to the rails, their hands drifting toward their weapons with the instinctive wariness of predators sensing something beyond their understanding. Eli continued his slow approach, extending his hand palm up in the universal gesture of peaceful intent. His father's hat cast shadow across his weathered face, but his eyes remained fixed on Diablo with the intensity of a man staking everything on a single moment of trust. "That's it," he said as the horse stretched his neck forward, nostrils flaring as he caught Eli's scent. "Just checking me out, making sure I'm safe. Smart boy. Your daddy would be proud of how careful you are." The words seemed to strike something deep in the horse's memory. Diablo's eyes softened, losing some of their defensive wariness. He took another step forward, bringing himself within arm's reach of the man who spoke with gentleness instead of commands, who offered partnership instead of dominance. When Eli's fingers touched Diablo's velvet muzzle, the crowd gasped as one. The contact was brief, barely a whisper of flesh against flesh, but it represented something extraordinary, the first time in 3 years that the killer horse had allowed voluntary human contact. "Good boy," Eli whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I know you remember kindness. I know it's still in there somewhere." The transformation in Diablo was subtle but unmistakable. The rigid tension that had defined his posture for 3 years began to ease, replaced by something that looked almost like relief. His breathing slowed, his stance widened slightly, and for the first time since arriving at McGraw's ranch, he looked like a horse instead of a weapon. McGraw's voice cut through the moment like a blade. "Enough of this nonsense. Get on the horse, Boone, or forfeit the bet." The harsh command made Diablo's ears flatten and his muscles tense, the old reflexes of fear and anger surging back to the surface. But Eli's hand remained steady on the horse's neck, his touch an anchor of calm in the storm of human noise and expectation. "Easy," he said again. "Don't let them rush us. We do this our way, in our time." He began to circle slowly around the horse, his movements fluid and unthreatening. This was the dance his father had taught him, the careful choreography of trust building that preceded any real partnership between man and horse. Each step was deliberate, each gesture measured to communicate respect rather than dominance. The crowd grew restless as minutes passed without the expected violence. They'd come for a spectacle, for the visceral thrill of watching a man get trampled by a beast that couldn't be tamed. Instead, they were witnessing something far more remarkable and infinitely less satisfying to their bloodlust, the patient work of healing that preceded all true partnerships. "This is taking too long," someone shouted from the crowd. "Get on with it. We want to see some action." But Eli ignored them all, his attention focused entirely on the magnificent creature before him. His father's hat shaded his eyes as he continued his careful assessment, reading Diablo's body language with the skill of a man who'd spent his life learning to speak horse. What he saw gave him hope, the gradual relaxation of defensive postures, the growing willingness to accept human presence, the faint spark of curiosity that suggested the horse's spirit hadn't been completely broken. When he finally reached for his father's rope, it was with movements so slow and deliberate they seemed to unfold in another dimension of time. The crowd leaned forward expectantly, certain that this was the moment when everything would explode into the violence they craved. Instead, Eli simply held the rope loosely, letting Diablo see it, smell it, understand that it represented no threat. The horse's eyes tracked the hemp and leather with intelligent attention, recognizing a tool rather than a weapon. "That's right," Eli said softly. "Just a rope. Nothing more, nothing less. Your choice whether you want anything to do with it." He began fashioning a simple halter, his fingers working with practiced ease while his eyes never left Diablo's face. This was the crucial moment, the point where trust would either bloom or shatter into 1,000 pieces. Everything depended on whether 3 years of abuse had destroyed the horse's capacity for partnership or simply buried it beneath layers of necessary self-protection. The simple bridle in Eli's hands was a masterpiece of gentle engineering, crafted from soft leather that had been oiled and worked until it felt like silk against skin. Unlike the harsh bits and cruel martingales favored by men who believed in breaking spirits through pain, this bridle was designed to communicate rather than dominate. The bit was smooth and jointed, the straps padded where they would touch sensitive skin, the entire assembly speaking of respect for the creature who would wear it. Eli had made it himself during the long nights of the past week, working by lamplight, while Sarah's quilt provided warmth and his father's memory guided his hands. Each stitch carried intention, each buckle positioned with care, every element chosen to offer partnership rather than subjugation. Now, standing in the center of the corral, with 300 pairs of eyes watching his every move, he held the bridle like an offering to whatever gods governed the relationship between man and horse. "Your choice," he said to Diablo, extending the headstall with movements slow as honey. "You can trust me, or you can fight me, but I won't force you either way." The horse studied the bridle with the intense concentration of an animal that had learned to read human intentions in the smallest details. His nostrils flared, catching the scent of honest leather and gentle purpose. His eyes, dark and intelligent, searched Eli's face for signs of deception or hidden cruelty. The crowd held its breath as Diablo stepped forward, drawn by something he couldn't name but couldn't resist. His muzzle touched the leather, testing its texture and scent. When he found no harsh metal, no cruel edges designed to cause pain, something shifted in his posture. The defensive tension that had defined him for 3 years began to dissolve, replaced by something that looked almost like wonder. "That's it," Eli whispered. "Just checking it out. Smart boy." With infinite patience, he slipped the bridle over Diablo's head. The horse tensed momentarily, old reflexes screaming warnings about human trickery and inevitable pain. But when the bit settled gently in his mouth and the straps lay soft against his skin, he found himself experiencing something he'd almost forgotten, the feeling of being handled with care. The crowd erupted in murmurs of amazement. They'd expected violence, had bet money on how quickly the killer horse would send Eli flying. Instead, they were witnessing something unprecedented. Diablo standing calmly, bridle in place, looking for all the world like a gentle saddle horse rather than the demon they'd heard described. McGraw's face had gone white as bleached bone. His silver spurs jangled frantically as he shifted his weight, suddenly aware that his sure-thing bet was slipping away like water through his fingers. The hired guns around the corral moved closer, their hands hovering near their weapons, with the nervous energy of men watching their paycheck disappear. "This ain't over yet," McGraw called out, his voice cracking with barely controlled panic. "Getting a bridle on him don't mean nothing. Let's see you stay on his back." But Eli was already moving to the next phase of his plan, his movements flowing with the natural rhythm of a man who'd spent his life working with horses. He ran his hands along Diablo's neck and shoulders, checking for tension, reading the horse's emotional state through touch. What he felt beneath his palms was remarkable, muscles relaxing, breathing, steadying, the gradual emergence of trust, where only fear had existed before. "Easy now," he said, positioning himself at Diablo's left side. "This is the big moment. You and me together, or not at all." He placed his left hand on Diablo's neck, his right on the horse's back. The crowd leaned forward expectantly, certain that this was when everything would explode into the violence they craved. Money changed hands in last-second wagers as 300 people held their breath. Eli's movement up and onto Diablo's back was so smooth it seemed choreographed, like a dance practiced 1,000 times. One moment he was on the ground, the next he was sitting astride the horse that had never been ridden, his father's hat casting shadow across his weathered face, and his gentle hands holding the reins with reverent care. Diablo trembled beneath him, 16 hands of magnificent horseflesh trying to process the impossible. A human sat on his back, and for the first time in 3 years, it didn't hurt. There were no spurs raking his flanks, no harsh bit tearing at his mouth, no voice screaming commands and curses. Instead, there was only the weight of a man who sat, balanced and still, communicating through pressure and presence rather than pain. "Good boy," Eli said softly, his voice carrying across the silent corral like a prayer. "Look at you, standing there like the gentleman you were born to be." The silence stretched taut as a bowstring. The crowd couldn't believe what they were seeing, the killer horse standing calm as a pond, the poor widower sitting easy in an imaginary saddle, the impossible made manifest in the harsh light of an Arizona afternoon. Then Diablo took his first step. It was tentative, experimental, the movement of a creature testing new waters. But there was no explosion of violence, no desperate attempt to unseat his rider. Just a single step forward, then another, as man and horse began to move together in perfect harmony. The crowd gasped as one. This wasn't what they'd come to see. This was something else, entirely something beautiful and terrible and completely unexpected. McGraw's voice cracked like a whip across the moment. "Time. How long has it been?" Tom Bradley consulted his pocket watch, his banker's precision warring with the wonder in his eyes. 4 minutes, he called out. 4 minutes and counting. 6 minutes to go. 6 minutes for a miracle to become permanent, for trust to triumph over fear, for two broken creatures to find wholeness in each other's company. Eli settled deeper into his seat and asked Diablo for a trot. The horse responded like they'd been partners for years, his gait smooth and collected, his ears pricked forward with something that looked remarkably like pride. The transformation was complete. The killer horse had become a gentleman, and the broken-down widower had found his purpose again. The ranch deed lay heavy in Eli's hands, its official seals and careful script transforming him from a desperate widower into one of the largest landholders in Arizona territory. The paper crackled slightly in the desert breeze, crisp with the weight of legal authority and life-changing consequence. Tom Bradley had prepared the document with meticulous care, his banker's training ensuring every clause and condition would stand up to the closest scrutiny. "Hard to believe it's real," Martha said, standing beside Eli on the porch of what had been McGraw's grand house just 24 hours earlier. The adobe structure sprawled across the hilltop like a small village, its red tile roofs and wide verandas, speaking of wealth beyond anything Eli had imagined possessing. "Feels like someone else's dream," he admitted, folding the deed carefully and tucking it into his shirt pocket. "Like I might wake up back in my old cabin, broke as ever and facing foreclosure." But it was real. The 10 minutes in the saddle had stretched into 20, then 30, as Eli and Diablo moved together with the fluid grace of partners who'd found perfect understanding. The crowd had watched in stunned silence as the impossible became inevitable, their bloodlust transformed into reluctant admiration for something beautiful and rare. McGraw had left town before dawn, his silver spurs and betting ledger packed hastily into saddlebags, along with whatever portable wealth he could gather. The hired guns had scattered like leaves before a wind, their services no longer required by a man who'd lost everything in a single afternoon. Word from the sheriff suggested McGraw had fled toward California, leaving behind debts and enemies in roughly equal measure. "What will you do with all this?" Martha gestured toward the sprawling ranch, its corrals and outbuildings stretching as far as the eye could see. "It's enough land for a dozen families." "Been thinking about that?" Eli's eyes found Diablo in the nearest pasture, the magnificent black horse grazing contentedly among McGraw's former stock. "Thinking maybe it's time to try something different, something based on gentling instead of breaking." The transformation in Diablo had been remarkable to witness. Within hours of their successful ride, the horse had shed the defensive aggression that had defined him for 3 years. He still carried the scars of past abuse, would always bear the marks of men who believed in dominance through pain, but his spirit had emerged from its protective shell like a butterfly from a cocoon. "Martha," Eli said, turning to face the woman who'd stood by him through the darkest days, "I need to ask you something important." She looked up at him with eyes that held warmth and understanding, patience and hope. The afternoon sun caught the silver threads in her brown hair, and he realized with a start that somewhere between Sarah's death and Diablo's redemption, he'd fallen in love again. "Ask away. This place is too big for one person, too much work, too much responsibility." He took her hands in his calloused fingers, intertwining with gentle strength. "I need a partner. Someone who understands that building something worthwhile takes patience and time. Someone who believes in second chances." Martha's smile was like sunrise after a long night. "Are you proposing, Eli Boone?" "I'm proposing a partnership, in business, in life, in everything that matters." He squeezed her hands gently. "Sarah's been gone 3 years. It's time I stopped living in the past and started building toward the future." "Yes," she said simply. "To all of it, yes." They were married a month later in the little church at Copper Ridge, with Preacher Williams conducting the ceremony and half the territory in attendance. The same crowd that had gathered to watch Eli get trampled by a wild horse came back to celebrate love, triumphant, and new beginnings blessed. Diablo wore a garland of desert wildflowers for the occasion, standing patient and proud as the wedding party posed for photographs that would become family treasures. The horse had become something of a celebrity, his story spreading throughout the Southwest as an example of what patience could accomplish where force had failed. The ranch prospered under Eli and Martha's careful management. They specialized in gentling horses that others had given up on, creatures damaged by harsh treatment and rougher men. Word spread that the Boone Ranch could work miracles with problem horses, and clients came from as far away as Texas and California seeking their services. Henderson, the county clerk, had kept copies of the Circle R registration papers, and through careful investigation, they'd managed to trace several other stolen horses in McGraw's former herd. The animals were returned to their rightful owners when possible, sold fairly when not, with the proceeds going to establish a fund for families who'd lost property to McGraw's schemes over the years. Sarah's quilt still lay folded at the foot of Eli's bed, but it no longer carried the weight of desperate loneliness. Instead, it had become a bridge between past love and present happiness, a reminder that the heart's capacity for affection could grow rather than diminish with use. On quiet evenings, Eli would sit on his porch with Martha beside him and his father's rope coiled at his feet, watching Diablo graze in the pasture that had become his kingdom. The horse had sired several foals now, passing on not just his magnificent conformation, but his gentle intelligence to a new generation that would never know the cruelty he'd endured. Sometimes visitors would ask about that famous Saturday afternoon, about the 10 minutes that had changed everything. Eli would smile and tell them it hadn't really been about the riding at all. It had been about recognizing pain in another creature's eyes and choosing understanding over dominance, patience over force. "Love can't be rushed," he'd say, unconsciously echoing Sarah's words from years past. You push too hard, try to force the pieces together, and the whole thing falls apart. But you take your time, match the edges careful-like, and you get something that'll last. The wedding ring on his finger caught the desert sunset as he spoke, its worn gold holding memories of love, found, lost, and discovered again. In the distance, Diablo lifted his head from grazing and nickered softly, the sound carrying across the evening air like a benediction. Some stories ended with justice served or scores settled. This one ended with healing, with the understanding that broken things could be mended if approached with patience and care. The ranch that had been built on fear and domination had become a place of partnership and trust, where gentle hands accomplished what harsh treatment never could. It was a legacy worth building, a foundation strong enough to last for generations. And in the quiet moments between sunset and starlight, Eli Boone knew that Sarah would have approved of the man he'd become and the life he'd chosen to build from the ashes of despair. The desert wind carried the scent of sage and promise, while overhead, the same stars that had guided cowboys and dreamers for generations wheeled in their eternal dance. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new horses to gentle, new lives to heal. But tonight, surrounded by love and touched by grace, Eli Boone was exactly where he belonged.